history of opera, opera singers have always sung music which was contemporary to them, or at most maybe 20 or 25 years old. Now, the last repertory opera, or Italian opera we might call Turandot, that's, 75 years old now. So any opera singer is, whether he likes it or not, is forced to be a little bit of a music historian. He has to deal with music that was written long before he was born. Then, music historian applied to the opera singer, that means the singer has to ask, what kind of singing does this music require? What kind of singing am I able to do? Is what I can do, and my voice, suitable to the interpretation of this music? We all know in America very, very well about music that was written for certain kinds of voices because we live in the tradition of Broadway. And it's within human memory that people like Richard Rodgers and Irving Berlin and Jerome Kern, all these great composers, wrote for specific people. And we know, for instance, we would never take a role that was written for Mary Martin and cast it with Ethel Merman, or vice versa. Although if you look on paper, the range of the two voices is very, very similar. It's not enough. The earliest text that I know of, and I think that we have, on singing is by a German man called Johann Andreas Herbst. And that was written in around I don't remember exactly, but in the 1650s, and was written in Nuremberg. What I imagine it is that there had been a new kind of singing current in Rome, circling around Carissimi, the great composer Carissimi, and a new kind of singing in which the line, the legato, the things that we would call bel canto singing were begun to be experimented. Before that, of course, it had been the music of Monteverdi, which is a long recitative, and the line and the legato singing and the singing of melodies was simply not a part of the singer's equipment. But anyway, Herbst, who seems to be explaining this new kind of Italian singing to a German public, says at one point, now, before you give singing lessons to a young person, a child, a boy perhaps, you must examine the voice and examine the child and make sure that the person is one that can profit by these lessons. He says, first of all, of course, listen to the voice and listen to its qualities. In order to qualify for taking singing lessons, the voice must be naturally of an agreeable quality and must naturally be, in the German, zittende und bebende. That means trembling and vibrating naturally. If Italian singing voices vibrated naturally in 1650, as they do now, then I would ask the so-called experts in the early music to tell me when it was they took the vibrato out, if what they say is true, and why on earth would they take the vibrato out? Let's examine for just a moment this strange idea that is in the currently now about early music or voices, but of the 18th century, much later than the time Herbst wrote. And that is, in order to stop the vibrato of your voice, you've got to put a load on the hyoglossus muscle right here. And that fixes the larynx and makes the vibrato stop. Well, when you do that, you lock the root of your tongue. Therefore, we can assume that the singers whose diction was legendary in Handel's time, Senesino, Faustina, cannot possibly have been locking the root of their tongue in order to stop the vibrato. The vibrato, of course, is something natural. You don't make the vibrato, you have to stop it. So if those two great stars had vibrato, then why do we have no evidence that there were some that did and some that didn't? Just to use two of the great stars. So therefore, I think it's all probably a great nonsense. I think that singers always used a vibrato. Maybe in the darkest of the Middle Ages they didn't, but we're not interested in that. All right, so 17th century singing centered around a few schools and centers. There was a Venetian center, only in Italy, really. France had its own tradition, but that doesn't interest us now. In Italy, the Venetians wrote a lot of operas. Those operas, Cavalli, the late Monteverdi, most of which are lost, those operas were dependent on fantastic stage machinery. Castles coming out of the ground, monsters flying down in the air, a stage with equipment something like that of Radio City Music Hall today. I have the impression, judging by the limited range in the music, and looking at the requirements that's put on the singing actors in Venice, that those were people who could sing a little, dance a little, act a little, but were not what we would call great singers, nor do you need a great singer to sing those pieces. That's why they're so popular in conservatories and places where the students, of course, are not great singers. All this was going along. Then in the 1670s and 80s, the people in Naples started to get very interested in this new idea that the Venetians were using, which was a theater, a public operatic situation. King of Naples, who was always the kings of Naples, were very interested in music. There's a lot to tell about that. But in any event, King of Naples of that period, I can't tell you his name, decided to have something new. And that was the Music Conservatory, a school, a factory in which you could turn out wonderful singers. He asked Alessandro Scarlatti, who was in his capella, to run the whole thing, and Scarlatti assembled around himself an equipe of the most wonderful teachers. He had Gasparini to teach how to play the figured bass. He had Durante to teach counterpoint. He himself, all of these people taught singing. And they turned out the first generation of really fabulous and great singers. We have the curriculum, the daily and weekly curriculum of that school. It's something terrifying. An hour of counterpoint. These are the singing students. An hour of counterpoint a day, an hour of harpsichord playing a day, an hour of figured bass a day, an hour of Italian letters a day, poetry, an hour of French letters, an hour of Latin letters, an hour of ancient Greek letters. Then putting them all together in recitation in all the languages, then putting it onto the singing. Oh, and then also there were singing lessons, putting the recitation of the poetry onto the singing voice. We know that they had a place they went to in the country, someplace outside Naples, I don't remember where, in which they could shout and their echo of their voice would come back, and so they could judge the effect that they were making. And they were all sent out there. Well, after years, and let's remember that the little boys that went into these schools were 10-year-olds to 8-year-old, 10-year-olds. Of course, they mostly had been castrated, not all. And by the time they were 18 or 19, they had already been studying seriously for 10 years. That's not possible unless you castrate little boys, because also girls have to wait until they become more or less mature to begin to study. Otherwise, they wreck their voices. So a 25-year-old or a 23-year-old today will at most have had 5 or 6 years of training. In the time of Scarlatti and then, of course, Handel, a 25-year-old had been working on their voice for 15 years. And quite a different result could be imagined. The voice still absolutely fresh because the subject is still very young, and the acquiring of this enormous technique. In the last years of this course, the student, was told to go up on the stage, sit down at the harpsichord. The teacher would name a subject, let's say Phyllis and Claudy, and the person was expected to improvise at the keyboard and with his voice a cantata of 3 movements, recitative and arias, three aria and recitatives. The poetry they were improvising had to scan. The poetry in the test might be in Italian, but it might be in French, it might be in ancient Greek or Latin. The man might have said a motet to the Blessed Virgin in Latin, for instance, and then the rest would all have to be improvised. And anyway, this is something fantastic. Well, of course, those people could improvise ornaments when they got up to sing a song in an opera. That wouldn't have been an issue. They could write music. And indeed, many of the castrati were music composers and published, and their operas were performed.